I'm Susan Matthews, and this is Stories from the Subverse. This is a spin-off of our podcast, The Subverse, and here we cover similar themes but with a more personal storytelling lens. In our second offering, you are going to hear a two-part story, hosted by Swati Kamble, on water and caste. Swati is an anti-caste, intersectional feminist researcher activist. Her research broadly focuses on human rights and social justice movements, decolonisation and intersectionality. There were a few things which led to this. One was the theme of water on our podcast, The Subverse, last year. I felt so compelled to cover stories around water and denial of this fundamental right through the lens of caste, given how integral this is to examining water in the Indian context. However, this was definitely a story that had to be told by researchers, academics, lawyers, artists, and activists who had both lived and ancestral experiences in this regard. And we wanted to provide a platform and space for the same. In this connection, I was so fortunate to have come across Swati and her incredible journey and work. In April 22, I attended an online lecture series organized under the aegis of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung on anti-caste histories and solidarities. Swati expertly moderated one of the sessions, and when I did contact her many months later, I was so grateful that she said yes to hosting this and conceptualizing the two parts of the story. The rest I leave to her, and all I can say is that this story is moving, it is heart-rending, it is educational, and for me it was life-changing, learning from her and the others who were part of this. So from me, Susan, it's now over to Swati.
Jai Bhim, Jai Jyoti Savitri, Hul Johar, Satrangi Salam to you all. I greet you all with these anti-caste salutations because these are the ways in which anti-caste communities collectively commemorate their histories of resistance. For part 1 of this podcast on water and caste, we will be looking at the relationship of water and caste and the history of Mahad Satyagraha, the March for Equality, Dignity and Access to Water, which was led by anti-caste leader Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar 96 years ago in 1927, and the impact this event has had on the constitution making of India. We have with us Advocate Disha Wadekar, a Supreme Court lawyer and anti-caste intellectual, who will give us legal and historical perspectives on how the Mahad Satyagraha kick-started the anti-caste movement and had an enormous impact on the constitution making of India. Before we hear my conversation with Disha, I will shed light on castes in India and what impact Mahad has had on the lives of many, including mine. You will then hear a Marathi excerpt of a conversation I had with a local anti-caste activist, Hira Kanuje. In a laborers' colony in Mumbai, I grew up listening to Hira's fierce speeches given on the birth anniversaries of anti-caste revolutionaries. In this excerpt, Hira opens her heart to narrate how, as a young child, she experienced untouchability and was denied access to water. Yet, defiantly, she would drink the water reserved for upper caste school children. Now, coming to the caste system in India, many of us might know that it is an ancient social construct, and even if it does not have any place in our modern, democratic society, it continues to exist. The caste system has been maintained and sustained by preventing any form of social interaction between the so-called impure, untouchable castes and those who self-proclaim themselves pure and therefore superior. This control and prevention of social interaction has been done very effectively through strict social laws of endogamous marriages and by not allowing interdining with those deemed untouchables. The other most visceral form in which untouchables have been denied their dignity and rights was by not allowing them to draw water from public water sources. Let us look at that history more closely. In the mid-19th century, Phule, the anti-caste social revolutionary, paved the way for 2 centuries-long resistance by opening his private well for the untouchables to draw water, at a time when even the shadow of untouchables was considered impure. Nearly 6 decades later, Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, a statesman, a constitutionalist, a scholar, mobilized people of all castes to lead a march for dignity and equal rights of the untouchables. Thousands of people marched to Mahad, a town in the erstwhile Bombay Presidency, on 20th March 1927 to exercise their rights. In every oppressed caste household in Maharashtra, you will hear stories of their elders in the family walking to Mahad or attending meetings held by Dr. Ambedkar. These are the stories that changed people's life courses. Stories are powerful, so I'll start with a story of my grandfather, who followed a caste occupation, one of the many inhuman traditions that untouchable communities were tied to. He wore a traditional attire, a colorful garb, like a long skirt. He grew his hair long, which was then matted and coiled. He carried a whipcord and a temple of a regional goddess Mariai on his head and begged for alms. He danced and whipped himself as a penance or loyalty to the goddess. In Maharashtra, this tradition is called Potraj. But as a young man, when he walked to Mahad to join the march, all those miles from his remote village in the Western Ghats, he pulled out each strand of his long-grown, matted hair as an act of renouncing his old enslaved life. The Mahad March had changed his life forever, and by extension, it put me on course for doing the work I do for social justice. Yet, in these 96 years since the Mahad March, we have stories that jolt us to realization that the struggle still continues. Merely months ago, Inder Meghwal, a 9-year-old boy, was beaten so brutally by his teachers that he succumbed to the injuries. His crime? He had drunk water from the pot reserved for upper caste teachers. Now you'll hear an excerpt of Hira. This 80-year-old has been our local anti-caste activist, and I have grown up calling her Hira Ajji, Grandma Hira. Grandma Hira got married to a meal worker, the son of her paternal aunt, at the age of 11, and came to Bombay in the early 1950s. As a young girl child, growing up in the meal workers' colony, I heard Grandma Hira conducting Buddhist prayers followed by a fierce speech. It is through her vibrant speeches that I first learned about the anti-caste movement, about her life and her lived experiences as an untouchable woman. She negotiated her lower casteness, her womanhood and poverty. She gave birth to 8 daughters to fulfill the wish of her husband to have a son. As a young child of age 14, she bore her first child and begged for food. In the chawl mostly of untouchables, she and her daughters would be the last to fill water at a public water tap. They had no utensils and filled water in small cooking pots, fairing multiple times, causing irritation to other women at the public water tap who also worked against the clock to do their daily chores before the water stopped. And yet, every 14th of April, she would stand up at the pandal narrating how Ambedkar changed the lives of the Mahara untouchables, such as herself. In this following segment, she opens her heart to share how, as a young child, she experienced untouchability and was denied access to water. Yet defiantly, she would drink the water reserved for upper caste school children. They would sneakily enter the local temple, where entry was strictly prohibited. These are silent revolutionaries whose stories are not documented and I thought of including her narrative in this podcast to honor her and many unsung feminists and anti caste activists like her. At school, we would sit for 4 or 5 hours. We would get thirsty, but in those days, we didn't have right to access to water. 20th March 1927, Dr. Ambedkar marched to Chavdar Lake. We all got the right to access water. In those days, it was okay if the animals drank water from open water source. But as humans, we were denied that right. Us Mahars did not have that right. This is how we were treated by people. So when we would get thirsty at school, we would have to plead a peon lady. Peon auntie, please give us some water. We are thirsty. Outside, there used to be a water pot with a cup to pour water from a distance. The peon would tell us to go outside of the school where the water pot was kept. Our school had staircases, so she would instruct us to stand at the lowest stair to maintain distance. Then she would pour water into our palms from above. Some water would get into our mouths and some into our noses. But what could we do? We had no choice. We would put up with this for a long time. But some days we would think, we'll have to teach them a lesson. They don't want to touch the water we've touched. They pour water from a distance and they say we are polluting. So let us teach them what pollution is. During the lunch break, our teacher would go to teacher's office. Other school girls would go home to eat lunch. My cousins and I would decide not to go home during lunch. On some days, we would carefully look around. When we had made sure no one was looking, then we would drink water from the forbidden pot and pour back leftover water that had touched our mouths. We would say, now drink this polluted water. Drink it. Our touch pollutes you. Now drink the water we have touched.
When I came to Mumbai after marriage, I started taking an active part in Baba Saheb's movement. I had a great interest in it. Since I could give speeches about the movement, local activists in this meal workers colony where I lived made me the chairperson of our local women's committee. So, through that role, I went to attend several meetings and conferences. I went to Delhi with Prakash Ambedkar's march. I went to Aurangabad and Nanded for a Dalit literature gathering and the Buddha Dhamma conference. I also went to Mahad. From that point on, I pushed myself into the movement without caring for my life. Now we come to the part where Disha will shed light on the significance of Mahad March in ensuring legal guarantees for equal citizenship's rights of the caste oppressed people. Welcome, Disha.
Thanks, Swati. The Indian Constitution, in many ways, is a radical change or a radical shift from the past. And the past, which was entrenched in caste and inequalities, and caste being the genesis of inequality and oppression in the Indian context, or one can say the South Asian context. As a student of constitutional law, as a lawyer, I have always been really fascinated by Article 17 and Article 15 of the Constitution, which is, according to me, in many ways, the heart and soul of the Indian Constitution. It is, in many ways, a social document. The Indian Constitution is not just a political document. And when you look at the fundamental rights chapter of the Indian Constitution, you realize that there are so many stamps and there are so many areas within the Constitution which you can trace from the anti-caste history, from the anti-caste struggles. Article 17 talks about the abolition of untouchability, as we know. And it doesn't just stop there. It also talks about how the practice of untouchability will be a criminal offense, will be treated as a criminal offense from here on. Article 15 talks about a provision for non-discrimination. Non-discrimination on the grounds of religious, race, caste, sex, place of birth. Article 15.1 is where it's saying that the state shall not discriminate against citizens on these grounds, on the grounds of caste, gender, sex, etc. But Article 15.2 is very interesting, and let me read that out to you. And we can trace the Mahad Satyagraha to this article, Article 15 says that no citizen shall, on the grounds only of religion, race, caste, sex, place of birth, or any of them, be subject to any disability, liability, restriction, or condition with regards to A. Access to shop, public restaurants, hotels, and places of public entertainment, or B. To the use of wells, tanks, bathing huts, roads, and places of public resort, maintained wholly or partly out of state funds or dedicated to the use of general public. Article 15 is essentially talking about the commons, the community resources, right? The public resources. And the commons in any democracy is supposed to be an equal commons, where each person is equal. What the caste system did was, and especially with respect to water, it said that the commons is caste ridden, which means that there will be certain people who will not be allowed to access the commons, who will be dismembered from accessing the commons, and water being one of those resources. One is to trace this entire legal history from the Mahad Satyagraha and the influence it has had in the constitution making process to finally culminate into Article 15.2, where every person will have the right to equal and full enjoyment of public resources. So it has had a direct influence on Article 15.2 and the Constitution in itself. But what is also interesting, Swati, is that you will see that Article 15.2 has two aspects. One is where the state cannot discriminate against citizens on the grounds of caste. And the other is 15.2, where individuals, private individuals, cannot discriminate against citizens. So we are not just talking about state discrimination by way of a law, a legislation, an order, but we're also talking about the day-to-day discrimination, which is so central to the manner in which the caste system functions. The pervasive nature of caste, and why caste is this horrendous monster, is that it is in our everyday lives, in our private lives, that caste is practiced. So the constitution is not just a formal document, it's actually going deep down, and it is actually dissecting the manner in which the caste system operates. And it is, in many ways, Dr. Ambedkar has put his mind in a very deep manner, where he's saying that discrimination will not just be from the state. He knows that private individuals and the private law of caste will supersede the state at times. So that's why Article 15.2 is so important.
Articulated Article 15.2, I have to look back at his, in 1930s, he wrote essays on waiting for a visa. And in that series of essays and anecdotes that he's sharing from his own life and lives of the other oppressed caste folks who have been at the receiving end of, this public social boycott and violence, the common theme is water. The common theme is access to public spaces, be it him after returning from the UK to do the service at Maharaja of Baroda's, government. He can't access accommodation in a guest house in Baroda where he can dignifiedly live. He is not allowed to drink water at his school. He's sharing experience of if there is no peon, there is no water. Ambedkar writes that your humanity is taken away by the way of you practicing this caste-based ostracization, untouchability. At the end of the day, there is legal recourse, but there is also a society who has its own practices, social practices, which are steeped in casteism. Like you said rightly, if we can go to that same line.
Swati, just to add to what you were saying, because I think it's very interesting. that you said that, water has been so central to this whole anti-caste struggle and anti-caste resistance. The reason being, it's not just about India or it's not just about the caste system. Water has been so central to the whole of civilizational struggles, right? Civilizations have been made and civilizations have been destroyed for the want of access to water, right? And in many ways, therefore, though water is a material resource, it's a resource, in many ways defines the power relations in your society. It is used to reproduce a certain kind of social order. The Dr. Ambedkar, for him, this water being at the very core during the Mahad Satyagraha and otherwise also is always at the back of his mind, is at the very core. He keeps saying, even in the Mahad conference, he said that this is not just about water. This struggle, this march is not about water, it's about reclaiming our human dignity. Dignity and equality is at the very core of the whole discourse, anti-caste discourse on caste and water. I think Baba Saheb does this great thing where he connects the right to access water to citizenship rights. The constitution is not just an event, it's actually this organic process of, where social movements and struggles and anti-caste resistance has had a major influence on this document. Baba Saheb, since the very beginning, since 1919, has been participating in the constitution making process. So you had the Southborough Commission, you had the roundtable conferences, you had the Government of India Acts that came, you had the States and Minority, which is a very important treatise by Dr. Ambedkar, right? So which has a major impact on, the constitution as it is today. The Southborough Commission, basically, it was a committee was formed to deliberate upon what the future constitution of India would look like, based on which the Government of India Act 1919 came, after which the Government of India Act 1935 came. Government of India Act 1919 and Government of India Act 1935 are almost like the backbone of the Indian Constitution. In 1919, when the Southborough Committee was convened, Dr. Ambedkar represented the depressed classes there. And he said that citizenship is not an abstract idea. It is actually a bundle of rights. So it's not like it's something in thin air, when you say citizenship, I'm a citizen of this country or I have been enfranchised in some manner. It means that I have a claim over rights. I have certain rights. And this bundle of rights is what citizenship is. He's trying to connect your right to equality, right to liberty, right to vote, right to equal participation. Here we're talking about equal participation in the commons. All of these rights are going to entitle you to your citizenship, right? He was also an economist, Swati. So he was very well aware of the economic deprivation that the caste system was also causing. He says that on account of incapacity and impurity at birth, we, as in the depressed classes, have faced tremendous economic losses. So this right to not access public resources, to not access water, to not access public roads it's not just about dignity. Yes, it definitely is about dignity, but it is also about our economic rights. So in many ways, Baba Saheb understood that your political rights are in tune with your socio-economic rights. For me, these two events were really important to then tell you what later happened. Actually, Bharat Patankar and Gail Ombit have written this piece in the EPW about the small mushrooming anti-caste movements before Baba Saheb came on the front. Before he entered, Mahad Satyagraha is where he enters as a mass leader, before which he's a scholar. From scholar to mass leader, that transition, when that is happening, there were already existing anti-caste movements. And S.K. Bole, in fact, who came from Bhandari community, which is actually a backward class community, and now in Maharashtra, it's a nomadic tribe, which is a toddy tapping community. So he was a representative in the Bombay Legislative Council. And people like S.K. Bole and others, who were also part of these small mushrooming anti-caste struggles and resistances that were happening in Maharashtra, they were trying to voice in the Bombay Legislative Council about these issues of the untouchables. And S.K. Bole, at that time, on 4th of August 1923, basically passed a resolution. And in the resolution in the Bombay Legislative Council, he notes that he actually resents the segregation policy in South Africa. it's very important to see how, these things are happening, the world, events in the world, the segregation policy, slavery, all of this civil rights movement in the US, all of it is having impact on what is happening in India also. So he is saying that we resent the South African segregation policy, but we must also remember that we need to set our own house in order. Untouchables should be allowed to use all public water places built or maintained out of public funds. So this was the resolution. This was the resolution that S.K. Bole passed at that time. And the Bombay Legislative Council then accepted it. Bombay then issued a direction to all government departments in Bombay on 11th September 1923 to give effect to this Bole resolution. Now, all your municipalities, municipal corporations were now supposed to give effect to this Bole resolution, where untouchables will be allowed to access public water places of all kinds. And you see that the Mahad Municipality passes this resolution in 1924. It says that this Chavdar tank, which is there in Mahad, it will be open for untouchables. So they are basically giving effect to the Bole resolution. Now, one would fathom that, okay, now there is nothing to stop you from accessing water. But that is not happening. It doesn't take effect. There is immense fear. There is immense direct threat of violence for the untouchable communities in accessing something as simple as water. How the caste law is this unsaid law, and how it subsumes everything, the society in general. And any sort of modern law trying to break it, trying to challenge it, like in this case, it was the Mahad Municipality's resolution, right? It was allowing you to access water, to have an equal commons and not a caste commons. But you would see that there is so much that the caste law holds, so much power that the caste law holds, that people were not able to exercise their right. And this is something that Dr. Ambedkar, observed. And in March 1927, like he gave a call for a march at Mahad, where the untouchables would go and would touch the water and drink the water, where that iconic event of where he's bending down in the Chavdar tank. Thousands of people came from all over Maharashtra and even in fact that time Gujarat to access and to claim their right to access water. You see that it was a non-violent struggle. It was a completely non-violent struggle, just about accessing water. They do that and then they sit and they gather in a nearby place, and which is when the Hindu oppressor castes attack them. And it is a one-sided violent attack with lathis and whatnot. After this violent attack happened, he did not even stop there, Swati. The water tank was purified. And this bears semblance again to the Sabrimala temple entry case. When I was representing in the case, I realized it was the Supreme Court allowed women to enter the temple. And when these two women tried to enter the temple based on a Supreme Court order, they were attacked violently. And not just that, the temple was purified after they entered. So this is the struggle that is happening every day that we're talking about. I feel that everything that happened in Mahad resonates so much, even today. After the Mahad Satyagraha and this violent attack that happened, on 4th August, unfortunately, 4th August 1927, the Mahad Municipality had to withdraw the resolution because of the violence that had happened. And Baba Saheb did not take this well. And in fact, he felt that this would lead to a somewhat, the morale of the people and thousands of those who had gathered in this huge event, in this massive event of claiming their rights and this assertion, this needs to go on. And that's where he decides to have a bigger march, a massive march around December 25, 26. And he gives a call for that march. And this is what he says when he gives this call. He says that this is a matter of equality. And he points out towards the duality and the hypocrisy of the oppressor castes. And he exposes it. He says that on the one hand, when it comes to railway coaches, you had those white-only coaches, right? And Indians from even oppressor caste locations were opposed to it. They were saying that, this is racism against us and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, you want same coaches for everyone, for Indians and for, the white people. But when it comes to untouchable, you are not ready to allow us access to water. Dr. Ambedkar spoke about after Mahad Municipality withdrew the resolution. And he was really angry. But what happened is the oppressor castes didn't stop there. They were so vicious that on 12th of December, just before this massive march was going to happen again in Mahad, when Baba Sahib had called everyone on 25th and 26th of December, on 12th March, they decided to file a civil suit in the Mahad court. And on 12th December, the Mahad Civil Court, what it does is it issues an injunction against Dr. Ambedkar. And it's an ex parte injunction where, the other side, ex parte means the other side is not heard. And this injunction prohibits Dr. Ambedkar from going anywhere near the Chavdar tank. Dr. Ambedkar, his morale has not gone down. He is still very spirited. As he had planned that he is going to go there on 25th December, he goes to Mahad on 25th December. He doesn't go near the tank. He follows the law. He follows the court's order. And he holds a very big meeting at the same place. And like Swati, he, rather than approaching the tank, creates this very novel idea of a struggle where on the 25th of December, he says that now we'll burn the Manusmriti. Because Manusmriti is at the core of this caste-based society of untouchability, which is actually, the source of these practices of not allowing us to access water. And he burns the Manusmriti at that same spot on the same day. So you see that in many ways, Dr. Ambedkar is following the law. He's a statesman. I think we spoke about it and you said that, he's a brilliant strategist, right? That on 25th of December, he says that we will postpone this movement till the pendency of the case. I think this is very important. For even, me being a lawyer, I think it's very important in some ways to respect the modern law. And he does that. He postpones the movement till the pendency of the case. He participates in the hearing. He argues in the court. He wins the case finally. And the verdict by the Mahad Civil Court is this, that basically the touchables were saying that this is our private property and we can just use it to the exclusion of others. But then it's basically a civil suit. And then the court's verdict is that the touchables have not been able to prove that this is a private property. So this is a public property. And therefore, the Mahad case is won by Dr. Ambedkar. So you see how beautifully, when it is about coming on the streets, he's on the street. When it was about intervening in courts and litigating, he's there. He's fighting on all these fronts. Boja Tharkam had written this book, Mahad, it's by Shared Mirror.
Yes.
And in that he compares the Dandi March to the Mahad Satyagraha. The Dandi March is actually a civil disobedience movement.
Yes.
It is about disobeying the law. And whereas the Mahad Satyagraha is actually following the law. It's actually trying to implement.
There is a luxury to, when you're a privileged caste, you have a luxury to disobey. And when you are criminalized by birth, that right is taken away from you. So it has been his, like, all along, lifelong path that he's followed is a constitutional path.
Because also being a pragmatist, right? It's so pragmatic for when you're from vulnerable communities, you're from marginalized communities, the consequences of disobeying the law, it will kill the movement. Yeah, completely kill the movement. All throughout, you are definitely talking about the caste system, but you're also constantly talking about asserting your right as an equal citizen. And this actually, in the whole history of, India, you will see that the Mahad Satyagraha, therefore, is so important because it's as simple as accessing water, but it is as huge, as enormous as claiming your right to an equal citizenship or reclaiming your human dignity. To me, the rights-based discourse really starts, in its most legal sense, starts with the Mahad Satyagraha in India. You will see again how it translates in the future constitution making process. In 1930, immediately after 1927, the march happens. And in 1930, the round table conference is convened, the second round table conference is convened. And basically, they have gathered, they come together to decide the future course for the Indian constitution. Now, what Dr. Ambedkar submits here is very important, and which you will see is directly coming from, again, from the Mahad Satyagraha. He talks about, this irony where the oppressed classes are not allowed to access water or the public resources, but their labor is used in building the same public resources, in building the same public inns, the public tanks, the public wells. You don't have any difficulty in drawing water from these wells or tanks that are built by on the labor of the oppressed caste. You don't have a problem when you take taxes from them to maintain these public resources. So he basically highlights at second roundtable conference, he says that the difficulty they find in drawing water from a well for the building of which they have paid taxes was one of the several cases of caste control that had to be protected against. So he's basically talking about this irony, he's talking about this hypocrisy. And this is where he basically submits in this second roundtable conference. He definitely, again, this time you saw in the Bole resolution, there was a reference to South Africa and the segregation policy there. Here, there is a reference to the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Protection Act of the United States at the second roundtable conference. And Dr. Ambedkar refers to the Civil Rights Act, Civil Rights Protection Act of the US. And he basically submits a memorandum for the inclusion of this particular right. And what was this particular right about? This particular right was about full and equal enjoyment of public resources, whether it's streets, tanks, etc. And the language is so much similar to Article 15. It's basically the same language, full and equal enjoyment of public resources, including water. Then you see that Dr. Ambedkar, again, again, his brilliance. He felt the need to also ensure that this was not just about private individuals discriminating. He was probably imagining and, he was foreseeing a few things. He was thinking about whether at some point, the state can also discriminate. The state can pass laws to discriminate and to not allow you access to public resources, to not allow untouchables access to these resources. So he also submits before the commission and he says that even the state needs to be incriminated. If the state tomorrow passes a law where it says that, untouchables will not be allowed to use so and so well or tank. Again, in states and minorities, 1947, which is, we know that it is this very important treatise for the constitution, which Baba Saheb writes. And a lot, what states and minorities is has been included in the Indian constitution, which came in 1950. And the states and minorities reiterates this provision, where any person who is denying a person of access to public water, tanks, streets, roads, etc., shall be guilty of an offense. So it was not just a right, but there was also a remedy. There was also punishment for treating you this way, right? And this is where states and minorities includes this in Article 2 on the section of fundamental rights of citizens. And then, of course, you see that this emerges in the Constituent Assembly debate. And Article 15 at that time in the draft constitution was Article 9. In the Constituent Assembly debate, and you see that, how this is coming, from Mahad Satyagraha to South Borough Committee to, the second roundtable conference to states and minorities in 1947. And now we're at 1950 where, the Constituent Assembly debates are happening, which is finally going to culminate into your constitution. And Article 9 is a direct import from the Mahad Satyagraha. There is some discussion about, what public resources, the word public is used in that article, access to public resources. So what this word public would mean, and Dr. Ambedkar tries to give it the broadest meaning possible. He's basically saying that anything that is not a small pond is basically a public, like water resource. And public would mean anything that is, wholly or partially maintained or funded by the state. And he gives the most broad meaning to what public would mean in public resources. And then this is reflected in Article 15 too. So all in all, this is basically the history that I wanted to trace. I wanted probably, our listeners to know about how the Mahad Satyagraha has had an immense influence on the whole constitution making process.
I was also reflecting on what you've said about the global movement, be it South Africa, the civil rights movement, or abolition of slavery in the US. You see Jyotirao Phule, in the 19th century, opening up his private water tank for the use of untouchable communities. And he writes Gulamgiri and dedicates that book. So you see that people that Ambedkar called his gurus, who were his mentors in their intellectual thoughts that they had passed on, he's also following that trajectory. Like water remains a common theme. Again, you've also traced the sort of these resolutions, legal guarantees for equal citizenship rights and water access and access to public resources. Now, denial of the water is at the heart of the, this religious sanctified untouchability, purity, pollution concept. And you have the legal recourses. Now, you've also mentioned that there has been wherever, like in resolution also, you see that even when the municipality passes a resolution, there is such a backlash from the society. So you have on one hand legal constitutional guarantees, on the other hand society which is not ready to let go of their very inhuman practices. At the cost of losing their own humanity, they are abiding by these practices. So to what extent does this legal recourse helps in eliminating the deprivation, ensuring the access, the march for dignity and access to water, the Mahad march that still continues every day? So if you could shed light on what extent the legal recourse has, helped in elimination, or what challenges still remain.
So, Swati, I would like to point, and this is a dilemma that I always face, where I'm constantly asking myself this question of whether the legal discourse is enough, you know, or whether the legal discourse or the law is actually ensuring that there is some sort of social change. But I also feel that coming from an oppressed caste location, I think that if we don't have the modern law, we don't have anything. And for us, like you were saying, therefore the constitution is so important and constitutional morality is so important. Like I said, Article 15 to Article 17 of the Constitution, which is about abolition of untouchability, and it makes the untouchability practice an offense, a criminal offense. And it also gives way for formulating a law, a criminal law. And by way of Article 17, you see that the Civil Rights Act came into being in India. The Civil Rights Act again talks about the same aspect of creating an offense where a person is preventing from accessing water because of his group membership or community membership. So that is the Civil Rights Act that came. Again, it is a criminal act. So it is, this offense of not allowing access to water is punished under this act. Then, following which is came the Atrocities Act, the SC/ST Atrocities Act. And the Atrocities Act 1989, and it goes in great details about different kinds of atrocities and untouchability practices. One amongst which is also denying access to water, right? Which is an atrocity in itself. It is a criminal offense again. And then in some states, like in the state of Maharashtra, you have the recent Social Boycott Act came into being. So you have some of these legal recourses, right? And they are mostly criminal legal recourses. But, despite the might of the law, despite the might of punitive law, criminal law, you see that, the caste law is superseding. We also need to talk about when the law is not sufficient or, will not do. Because the problems we will now face might not just be about not allowing a person from a Dalit community to access water. They will be more systemic also. We are talking about climate change.
Absolutely.
We are talking about, who are the people who are residing in the low-lying areas of rivers, who are the ones whose houses are at the risk of getting flooded, and what are the areas in cities or in villages, where clean water is not accessible, clean drinking, flowing water is not accessible. Who are the people who are living in these slums where there is, this water is not accessible?
It's very interesting that you come to climate change, climate crisis that the humanity is facing, and rightly said that, at who is multiply burdened and at the receiving end of the wrath of the climate crisis. I had a last question for you, which is pertaining to climate crisis. Just recently, to prepare for this podcast, I was reading this excerpts from a book called Monsoon Economies, India's History in a Changing Climate. And this book also maps the, water and caste, and maps the history of lack of access of oppressed caste communities to water. It cites the survey of 1990s, not that long ago. In that survey, you see that the author claims that whereas caste sentiments declined in many areas of life of the untouchable communities, possibly water shortages aggravated it. So his claim is that wherever you have scarcity of resources, the formally, practices of be it untouchability or segregation, they aggravate because the resources or material are scarce. The oppressed caste communities are at the receiving end of climate crisis, as you have rightly mentioned. Would you be able to elaborate on this more?
From what you were saying, it sort of comes across the author is trying to pin it on lack of economic, resources. So to me, I feel like this is usually a very one-sided way of looking at it, like just from, a class point of view or from the economic aspect of it. Caste is definitely economic, but it's also cultural and social and religious, right? And it has its sanction from religion. It's not just about lack of resources for everyone. Even when there is enough and more for everybody, even then the caste system operates, right? In the most abundant areas where there are most abundant natural resources, also you see that the caste system is full and it's operating. If this survey is of 1990s, so I think it's important to also mention about in this whole line of anti-caste struggles, this movement called Ek Gaon Ek Panotha that happened in Maharashtra. This movement where, it was led by Dr. Baba Adhav, and in so many villages in Maharashtra, even at that time, and we're talking about 80s and 90s here, you were seeing that there were two different. Now, Panotha means public well or water bodies, yeah, that are public, that are open to public, right? Now, in every village in Maharashtra, you saw that for the untouchables, there was a different water body in every village. And for the touchables, there was a different water body. So there were two panothas or two public bodies in one village and continue to in so many. And there was therefore, this need was felt to start this whole movement of, one village, one panotha, one village, one public, water tank or pond or source. Some of these understandings are not very well rooted in the social understanding of caste. Event of Mahad and this March of Mahad will always have an imprint on me as a lawyer, a constitutional law scholar. Thanks for allowing me to share some of these insights, Swati.
I would like to close by thanking Hira Aji and Disha for giving us this rich narrative on Mahad Satyagraha with personal stories and legal history. I thank Susan Matthew of Dark and Light magazine and their podcast Stories from the Subverse for providing me with this platform, and the Waka team for their collaboration. Many thanks are due to anti-caste artist Shrujana Sridhar for her amazing poster, and Mayura Savi of Vyaktitva Learning Lab for providing us with beautiful drawings of school children on the theme of Water is for All. Stay tuned for the next episode.
Thank you to Swati Kamble, Hiraji, and Disha Vadekar for sharing with so much passion and heart their lived experiences and wisdom. And as Swati mentioned, a special thanks to Mayura Savi, who organized a very special learning event with children from Ramabai Nagar in Navi Mumbai. And to Shrujana Sridhar, who created amazing cover art for this podcast episode. Stories from the Subverse is the podcast of Dark and Light, a digital space that chronicles the times we live in and reimagines futures with a focus on science, nature, social justice, and culture. You can follow us on Instagram at Dark and Light Zine. This podcast has been recorded and produced for us by Waka Media, and we are very thankful to them. The next part of the story will be released mid-April. So long, and thanks for listening.